Hello and welcome to It's a Code U, mental health support for those working in healthcare. This is a podcast created for healthcare employees to explore not only issues relating to mental and emotional health, but also unique challenges that those working in healthcare are faced with. Your hosts are Adina Tucker, a licensed clinical social worker with Dartmouth Health, and Jennifer Hinsey, an MSW also with Dartmouth Health. Hello and welcome to It's a Code U. This week, we are going to be talking about two specific mental health disorders: oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder. And those can be seen in children and adolescents. So, we're going to talk about the criteria for these disorders, what some of the challenges might be for both the parent and the child. We'll also talk about what some things are that parents might want to keep in mind, or things that might be helpful in navigating a diagnosis of either of these. Okay. Today, we have with us one of our colleagues, Stephanie Chesnut. Stephanie is a licensed marriage and family therapist with Dartmouth Health Behavioral Health Solution. Before coming to DHBHS, Stephanie worked for 9 years with children in K through 12 public schools, as well as having a private practice. We are excited to have you with us today and to dig into these two disorders and provide some education and information for parents. So I will kick things off by just asking if you can explain the difference between ODD, which is what people in the field normally call oppositional defiant disorder. So from here on out, we'll refer to it as ODD, and conduct disorder. What's the difference between those two?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me, first of all. And yes, it is a mouthful: oppositional defiant disorder. I look at oppositional defiant disorder as a spectrum of behaviors on which, like, conduct disorder is the more severe side of it, like when the diagnostic criteria reaches a more severe side, and then conduct disorder that persists into adulthood is typically diagnosed as antisocial personality disorder. So that would be the adult kind of version of conduct disorder. And one of the really important things about both of these is that you really have to take into account the developmental milestones that the children have reached, because some of these things you're going to read and you're going to say, okay, my kid does this. And does that mean that my kid has ODD, or does that mean my kid has conduct disorder? Well, no. If your 3-year-old is biting people and tearing up like their coloring, they do not have conduct disorder. If your 12-year-old is doing that, then that might qualify for conduct disorder. So just to keep in mind as we're discussing the criteria, like, we do want to keep in mind like the developmental kind of milestones of where the kids are at. So for example, for oppositional defiant disorder, some of the criteria include angry and irritable mood. They often lose their temper. They're touchy, easily annoyed, angry, resentful, argumentative, defiant, argue with authority figures or adults, refuse to comply with requests, deliberately annoys others, often blames others for their mistakes and behaviors. And I'm sure there's a lot of parents who are listening and like, wait, that describes my teenager perfectly. Does my teenager have oppositional defiant disorder? And the answer to that is probably not, unless it has been diagnosed by a licensed mental health care professional. And it really goes to the level and the extreme, right? Is this something that is like really outside the norm of what a teenager might be experiencing? And typically the onset for these is for oppositional defiant disorder tends to be between like 5 and 10. And for conduct disorder tends to be slightly older, more around adolescent age. And typically what happens is that somebody will be diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder first. And then if the behaviors continue escalating, they'll be diagnosed with conduct disorder. The big difference between oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder is that conduct disorder really is about violating the basic rights of others or basic societal norms and rules. So there's a level of aggression there that is not present with oppositional defiant disorder. So we're talking about aggression to people and animals. They bully and intimidate others, instigate physical fights, use weapons. They're physically cruel. They deliberately engage in things like fire setting, destroying other people's properties, breaking and entering. It's a much higher level. So when you look at conduct disorder, most of the things that the kids with conduct disorder do would be considered crimes, right? So there's a huge difference in kind of the escalation there. And so something to think about is that not every kid who has ODD is going to be diagnosed with conduct disorder. And not every kid who's diagnosed with conduct disorder is then going to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. It's about 40 to 50% of kids with OD may later meet the criteria for conduct disorder. And it's more common in kids who have more severe symptoms and those with additional risk factors, such as severe trauma, family dysfunction, socioeconomic disadvantage, things like that. And then with kids with conduct disorder, about 25 to 40% of those kids end up to develop antisocial personality disorder in adulthood. And actually, one of the criteria for antisocial personality disorder is that you were diagnosed with conduct disorder in childhood. So that's one of the things. But for conduct disorder, one of the main traits is that it's like lack of empathy, lack of guilt, shallow affect. Whereas in my experience, kids with ODD, like they may react explosively, they might be really angry and things like that, but they typically feel badly about the way that they have behaved. They typically feel a lot of guilt, a lot of shame, a lot of remorse. And I want to say that this is all like generalizations, right? So, because there's certainly kids with conduct disorder who do feel shame and guilt and things like that. But on a general level, we see a lack of empathy that happens with kids with conduct disorder. Um, and one of the reasons that we see that, so I personally conceptualize this, and I don't know that this is necessarily the way that like the entire mental health community conceptualizes it. But for me, oppositional defiant disorder tends to be more environmentally based, and conduct disorder tends to be more genetically based. And we see that with brain scans. So on brain scans, we can see that people with conduct disorder and later antisocial personality disorder tend to have a reduced amygdala volume, and that's associated with aggressive behavior and reduced empathy. And it contributes to lack of ability in recognizing and responding to distress in others. Like oftentimes people with conduct disorder, this really goes back to why it's so important to get early intervention, right? Because we want to prevent those kids with ODD progressing to conduct disorder and then progressing to antisocial personality disorder. There is a common comorbidity with ODD and conduct disorder, and that is ADHD. About 30 to 45% of kids with conduct disorder and ODD also have ADHD. And it can be really difficult to get these diagnoses because there's a lot of things that mask and mimic other things. We've got intermittent explosive disorder, we've got major mood regulation disorder, like lots of different disorders, right? But oftentimes ODD is what a child who is really having trouble being able to maintain their composure in school, in like settings that are important to be able to behave. That's typically when a child is first diagnosed, is like when they're hitting school age and they are really not being able to be in a classroom and behave appropriately. And so at that point, oftentimes the schools will recommend, hey, your child should be evaluated.
That was a phenomenal and incredibly informative answer. I will say that. So thank you so much. It actually got me thinking. So you got me thinking about trauma in kids. And I'm wondering, can kids who are showing signs of trauma, is that often misdiagnosed or misread as ODD by chance?
I think it can be. I think that kind of the distinction for me is not actually all that important. For me, ODD is a symptom of trauma. That's just my personal belief. I think that a lot of mental health disorders are actually a symptom of trauma. And in this particular case, I think kids with ODD tend to have trauma that a lot of times people don't consider trauma. When people think of trauma, they think about it as like big T, like you got into a car accident, right? You were robbed, something big happened to you. And people oftentimes discount what I consider trauma with a small t. And that's not to discount it at all, but the daily stressors of having food insecurity, housing insecurity, having inconsistent caregivers, having witnessed domestic violence, and just having a lot of instability in your life. And so what I have personally seen in working with kids with ODD is that they have had a very unstable childhood, and that ODD is a way for them to try and regain control, right? So that defiance that we see with the adults, that real kind of determination to do what I want, when I want, it's oftentimes because they don't trust the adults in their lives. The adults in their lives have let them down time and time again. They've shown that they cannot be trusted, that they cannot be people that take good care of them. And as a result, they have come to the conclusion, only I can take care of myself and I know what's better for myself. And to be frank, some of the kids I've worked with, that is the case. They actually are more mature than their parents in some ways, or more thoughtful than their parents. And they don't see the way that the parents don't see the way that their actions have impacted their kids. Now, I do want to take a step back and say, I understand this can be really hard for some parents to hear, and I don't want people to think that I'm blaming parents. A lot of things that can cause trauma are outside of a parent's control. But when we talk about how to support kids with ODD and conduct disorder, one of the things that I'm going to touch on is consistency and stability is one of the absolute most important things. Like, they need to know that they can trust you, that they can rely on you, that you are going to do what you say when you say you're going to do it, and that, any consequences that are meted out are going to be fair and appropriate. And that's actually also another characteristic of ODD. They tend to be very preoccupied with whether or not something is fair and whether it has been fair to them. So vindictiveness can sometimes be a characteristic of ODD. And that is oftentimes because they feel like they have been wronged in some way, right? So that's also one of the diagnostic criteria that can be taken into consideration when we consider like our kids acting out. So again, when we're thinking about kids acting out and being defiant, and we've got a 3-year-old who's saying, no, I don't want to go to bed, that's developmentally appropriate, right? When we have kids who are in math class in 7th grade being like, no, I'm not going to do what you say, and I don't have to listen to you, and whatever, that would not be appropriate, right? Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, it absolutely did, and more. And it's really such very helpful information I think you've shared, especially when we're considering how do we treat kids who are dealing with ODD and things like that, and the intersection of trauma there, and how trauma is just so prevalent with all of these things. So thank you so much. That was great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Talk about whether it's more like the prevalence among the genders or not.
I'll talk a little bit about that. So again, for me, this goes back to the manifestation of trauma, right? Again, this is generally speaking, broad overview, but boys tend to externalize their emotions, especially if they're aggressive, angry emotions, which is what boys are socialized to be able to express. And girls tend to internalize their emotions, right? And so I just want to put out there, this is my own personal hypothesis. This is not something in the literature. But in that sense of control that we see that ODD kids are trying to establish, for girls, I would say it often turns inward and can turn to things like self-harm or eating disorders or things that they can control, right? Because kids are essentially trying to control something that is within their control. It stems from feeling powerless and unsafe during those traumatic experiences that they've experienced. And it's these oppositional behaviors are attempt to regain a sense of control and predictability in their lives. And so the kids will try to control what they can control, and they will try to control things that they can't control. And that's the kind of explosive outbursts of behavior that we see. So it is more prevalent for boys to be diagnosed with both and conduct disorder. As they get older, it levels out for ODD when they hit adolescence, where girls start to be diagnosed at a greater rate, where we start to see more of those oppositional behaviors. But especially when they're younger, it does tend to be more boys. And I think I had the numbers in here. Yes. So in childhood, these are more common in boys. In adolescence, the rates tend to even out. It's approximately a 4-to-1 ratio in early childhood. And so one difference in the way it manifests is that girls with these sorts of disorders will have more relational aggression. You'll see a lot more of like mean girl, like under the radar kind of bullying. They'll try to exert control over their friend groups in a lot of ways, versus I think boys tend to try to control like their outward environment, try to control the adults in their lives. So I would say girls tend to be underdiagnosed. But again, it goes back to that idea of they're experiencing trauma at the same rates. They're just manifesting the effects of that trauma differently. Statistically estimated to be between 5 to 11% of children are diagnosed with, and for conduct disorder, it's about 2 to 10%. It's not huge populations, but the effects of these kids, they're often felt very strongly, like within their families and within their school environments. These kids tend to be really disruptive and dysregulated, right? And it can be really difficult for families who are trying to deal with this. And I think parents are always trying to do their best, and we never want to think that something that we're doing might be causing or exacerbating a child's symptoms and stuff like that. But when you have a kid who's diagnosed with either of these, I just want to say it's so important for parents to get additional support, right? None of us are born knowing how to be parents. Most of what we learned about parenting is because our parents parented us, right? And so with all the good and bad that comes with it, and it did used to be that it was acceptable for corporal punishment. And many people grew up being hit and they were controlled in that way. And now a lot of people will say what that kid needs is just a good spanking, right? And I'm so glad we don't do that anymore. I'm so glad that that's not prevalent because, again, that contributes to childhood trauma. But it can lead to less, quote unquote, compliance, right? Less visible compliance. And so people are like, well, people just don't know how to parent anymore, right? But previously, okay, beating a child into compliance is not a healthy form of compliance, right? We want a child to comply because what they're being asked to do is what's good for them, right? We're wanting to help them, we're wanting to support them, we're wanting for them to be healthy, whole adults. And that's why we're asking for compliance, right? We want you to do your math homework because in the future, you're going to need to know how to do math, right? We're not trying to ruin your life.
Oh, that was so helpful. That was great. And actually, it made me think about one of our next questions, and that is, are there certain behavioral techniques that parents can use to help with some of the challenging behaviors?
Yes. So there are some certain behavioral techniques that parents can use. And I guess I would say they're not very different than what I would advocate for all parents to use in general parenting, right? This is general good parenting advice. But I will say that if you have a child with ODD and a child with conduct disorder, you need to get additional outside support. I encourage you to not think I can just muddle my way through on my own. It's not something you want to go at without expert help. And I will say that is especially true in the case of conduct disorder, right? Because when you have a child with conduct disorder who is hurting other people, hurting animals, destroying property, like that is a situation that you need really big wraparound care. And that can be so difficult to get. And I totally understand and empathize with that because in this country, so much of that support depends on the community that you live in, right? Are you living in a community that funds mental health supports? Are you living in a community that provides like social services and intensive like outpatient or inpatient treatments and residential schools and things like that that would definitely be necessary to really help support some of these really high level, high risk kids who are really struggling and really hurting, but they're also at danger of hurting others, right? So like for conduct disorder specifically, don't go at it alone. In terms of behavioral techniques, there's the general ones that, like I said, are good for anybody. So we've got, positive reinforcement. We've got using collaborative problem solving skills. That's a specific technique that Ross Greene has. So if you have a child with any of these disorders, I strongly suggest you check out Ross Greene. He's got some great books. One is called The Explosive Child, and it really talks you through what is going on internally for this child and what are the ways that you can do this. One of the things about kids with ODD that I find is that they need to know the why. Why am I being asked to comply for something, right? It's not enough to just be like, because I said so, right? Which is what a lot of our parents said to us, right? Because I said so, right? I'm your parent. You have to listen to me, right? That is not a good enough reason for kids with ODD. That will not fly with them. If you want them to comply, you need to discuss this rationally with them. They need consistency and stability in their life, and they need consistency and stability with clear expectations and boundaries. And one of the things that can be so difficult is if you are a parent who is co-parenting and you are not on the same page with your co-parent, like having that consistency and stability of expectations is so difficult. So family therapy for mediation, for getting on the same page is so important, and really asking your co-parent, no matter how acrimonious the situation might be between the two of you, to really recognize we're both here. We love our child. We want our child to have the best. We need to get on the same page for what the expectations and consequences are, right? Because otherwise the child, especially one with ODD, is going to play the parents off of each other. So when I talk about consistency and stability in life, one of the things that I'm going to bring up that I think a lot of parents probably might feel personally attacked in this, but so when we talk about consistency and stability in life, that includes the consistency and stability of the adults in that child's life. And one thing that I see a lot is a rotating door of significant others and partners that are in and out of this child's life that this child is supposed to suddenly start listening to and seeing as an authority figure. And they're going to rebel against that. That's normal. And that instability and not knowing who is this person, why is this person suddenly in my life, it can be so damaging. And so I really encourage people to really limit when they introduce a child to a new significant other until it's like really, really serious. You know that this person's going to be in your child's life for a very long time, because you also cause attachment rips when somebody that a child does get attached to goes away. And that, again, that inconsistent caregiving causes attachment issues, and that can cause a lot of issues later in life as well. One of the worst things that you can do for a child with ODD is to back them into a corner. And I mean that metaphorically, sometimes literally, metaphorically. And I saw this a lot in schools. And this was incredibly difficult because I really feel for teachers where they have 20 kids that they are trying to get to comply on something, right? That they typically don't want to comply on. And you've got one child that is going to be super disruptive and just oppositional and just like, I'm not going to do what you say. I don't have to listen to you. I'm just going to do whatever I want, right? And we have a lot of teachers that are old school and they go back to that approach of, I'm the adult. You have to listen to me. You have to show me respect, which I 100% agree with. Children definitely should show people respect. So children should definitely show people respect. But kids with ODD, one of their big things, again, going back to that fairness piece, is that they want to be shown respect, right? And so if they feel that a teacher is not showing them respect, another adult is not showing them respect, they will dig in their heels and even more so be like, no, I don't have to show you respect. I don't have to listen to what you have to say. But one of the absolute worst things that you can do with a kid with ODD is to call them out in front of their peers or in front of other people. And all that's going to do is make the kids dig in their heels even more because now they can't lose face, right? Their entire identity is based on, I know better than the adults in my life. I know better than them and you can't make me, right? You are not going to be able to force me to do this. And the truth is we can't, right? That was the whole point of corporal punishment in the past, right? Is to force compliance of a child. And we don't do that anymore. Again, thank goodness. But a lot of adults still approach it as, yes, I'm going to force compliance on you. And kids like, you can't. And literally, we can't. What am I going to do, right? When I was working in schools, I'm like, I'm not going to tear the phone out of your hand and say, you have to put the phone away, right? That's not what we're going to do. But I see a lot of teachers get really upset and just demand this child needs to be punished. This child needs to have consequences and consequences, definitely. But there's that kind of punitive aspect that has more to do with the teacher or the adult's feelings about the situation than what's actually going on, right? The teacher or the adult feels disrespected. And they have been. I'm not going to deny that. They have been disrespected. But it's really important to remember who's the adult and who's the child here. And more than anything, I want people to take away from this is a child cannot be more emotionally regulated than the adult they are dealing with, right? And so what I often see is that adults get really triggered by their own stuff when they're having these conversations and this battle back and forth, this battle of wills with the kids. And they're like, no, I'm going to impose my will on this child. And this child is like, no, you are absolutely not going to impose your will on me, right? And that starts to become more about me as the parent being like, no, you need to do this, right? And again, you will not win in that scenario. And as you get escalated, the child will get escalated too. So one of the most important things I can say is like, when that situation is happening, you need to take the child out of the situation, right? Take them into a hall, take them in another room, right? If great Aunt Mildred is watching this, me like, well, in my day, we would just do, right? No, take the child out of that situation. You need to have kind of a quiet place and you need to help that kid regulate their emotions. And they're not going to want to. They're absolutely not going to want to. And this, again, can be really hard. And this is great where if you have a co-parent, you can be like, okay, I need to tap out here. You need to take care of this because I'm feeling too escalated, right? So somebody else needs to come in, another teacher, an administrator, somebody else, because I'm finding myself triggered. And you guys all know what that feels like, right? When you feel like that tightness in your chest where you're just like, ooh, like this kid is getting my goat, right? That is not the time when you want to be issuing consequences, when you want to be having conversations about why their behavior is inappropriate, right? Because oftentimes we are so escalated that we are exhibiting some of those same behaviors. So you want to get that child into another space and get them calmed down and get them to be able to start to reflect on their behavior and to start explaining to them why you are asking them what you are doing and start to go to a collaborative problem-solving approach. And again, that's Ross Greene's approach. You can take a look at that in his book. But the idea is really that we don't want as parents to be on either end of the spectrum of being an authoritarian parent or to be a permissive parent. And I find that when we have kids with ODD and conduct disorder, their parents tend to fall on one of those extremes, right? Oftentimes the permissive piece, because I don't know what to do with this kid anymore. Like, fine, whatever, do whatever you want. I'm sick of dealing with you. I don't care anymore. I don't have any control. You're right. So you can do whatever, right? Versus the authoritarian parent was like, I'm taking the door off the hinges. I'm taking every single item that you own. You are going to listen to me. I'm going to send you to military school, right? But both approaches are not good with these types of kids. And in general, they're not great approaches. You want to be someplace in the middle. You want to have clear expectations and boundaries. And so this is the authoritative approach, clear expectations and boundaries with also some space for shades of gray, right? You want your child to be able to come to you and be like, hey, this felt really unfair because of this. And you as a parent, again, you might be feeling triggered. It's like, well, that wasn't unfair. I made a very fair choice, right? You need to hear the kid out because so oftentimes kids with ODD, they don't feel heard. They don't feel listened to. And we see that so much when the adults are getting triggered, where it's like, okay, I shouldn't have to listen to my child. I'm the adult. They should be doing what I say. Okay, again, we can look at like corporal punishment for compliance, but other than that, there's not a good way to force a child to comply. So you really want to make them a partner in problem solving this with you. And so, again, this is where I really encourage people with kids with ODD and conduct disorder to go to parenting classes. It is not a sign of being a bad parent to go to parenting classes. It is not a sign of failure. It is not no. We all need to go learn more about how to be good parents, right? Because the research has changed. The research changes and grows. And as we learn more about kids, so it's so important that you as a parent are able to say, I am willing to look at my own stuff. I'm willing to own my own stuff. I am willing to try and change my own behavior to try and change my child's behavior, because that's the only way that it's going to change, right? I can't tell you how many times I would have a parent come into my office and be like, fix my child. And it's like, that's not how this works. I can't fix your child because the environment that your child is in is not conducive to doing better, right? So we need to fix the entire environment. That includes anybody who is an important figure in this child's life, grandpa, grandma, aunts, uncles, older siblings, like teachers, social workers, like it all needs to come together, especially with the kids with conduct disorder. But you need a village to help parent kids like this. So don't try to go at it alone. Don't think it's a sense of failure or a sense that you are not doing a good job as a parent. It is a sign that you are doing a good job as a parent if you are bringing in these supports and this additional help.
So you were talking about how kids with ODD specifically really need consistency and stability and to know what's coming and all of that. And I was just wondering if you could speak to what are some things that might be more emotionally difficult for a child that's dealing with one of those diagnoses, or that they might have a harder time adjusting to than maybe a child who's not dealing with that.
That's a great question. I don't know that I have the exact answer, but off the top of my head, what it goes to is, who is the person that I can count on in my life? And if that person goes away, is incarcerated, for example, goes on a long trip, parents split up, grandma dies, right? If the person who's my primary attachment figure is no longer there, I think that's hard for anybody, but especially for kids with ODD, they will become extremely dysregulated. And I think any changes in living situations, especially if they are not provided information about that, with like long telegraph, right? If you know that you're going to be changing because of a job move or something like that, like you want to let your kid know as far in advance as possible. You don't want to spring it to them a month before and be like, by the way, we are leaving all your friends and we're moving across the country and you'll never see grandma again and you'll never see your best friend Johnny again, right? Like, you want to try and include the kids in the conversation as much as possible in a developmentally appropriate way, right? But yeah, so in my experience, it's when you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? It's those things that are at the really base level of the hierarchy of needs that are most triggering for kids with these types of disorders, when they're like, I don't have food, I don't have shelter, I don't have physical safety, right? All of those things are going to be something that just causes that child to just dig in more and be like, I can't trust the adults in my life to provide this for me. So I am on my own, right? Fundamentally for me, ODD is a kid who's saying, I'm on my own and I can only take care of myself. So why should I listen to what anybody else is asking me or telling me to do? Because they have not been consistent. They have not been safety. They are not people that I can count on.
So, Stephanie, where would you recommend that parents go for support?
So one of the first places that you can start with for support is your local community mental health agency. And so I can't speak to everywhere in the country, but I know in Vermont and New Hampshire, we have community agencies that are well versed in helping and supporting families with children like this. So in Vermont, we have Healthcare and Rehabilitation Services of Vermont that serves like the Windsor County and Springfield areas. And then we have the Claire Martin Center that serves the more northern area. And then in the Lebanon area on the New Hampshire side, we have West Central Behavioral Health. So they are great places to start. You can also start with your pediatrician's office. They will often have referrals that they can give you. And I didn't touch on it too much, but medication can be a support for kids like this, right? It can help them regulate their emotions. So that is something to consider talking about with your PCP, talking about with potentially a psychiatrist. These community agencies can also help you find mental health supports in addition to case management support, sometimes respite supports. And so they can be a great resource. And if you're not familiar of things in your area, another great place to start is just by calling 211. And in each state, 211 tends to have the repository of all the kind of different services that are available in a state. So when you don't know where to go, that can be a good start. The schools are also a great place to go. I will also say something that's important for parents to know, and most of them do know this, I think, because oftentimes it's the school that's making the referral of, yeah, your kid needs to go see somebody. We think your kid has ODD, right? Because that's oftentimes where it manifests and really starts to be an issue. But kids with these diagnoses do qualify for special ed services. I can't speak for the entire country, but at least in New Hampshire and Vermont, these kids do qualify for special education services, typically under the diagnosis of emotional disturbance, right? And so as a student with special ed, the schools are required to provide certain services. And that often includes working with the school psychologist. It can include additional testing. It can include modifications. So for example, if your child gets triggered about certain things, like I'd have children, for example, who were, if they were reading about specific things, specific topics, like that would be really upsetting to them and set off an episode. So maybe an accommodation that your child would have an alternate assignment. Like if reading a story about somebody who's homeless or somebody whose grandmother died or something like that might be something that is very difficult for them. Those are the supports that I would probably start with. And once you get into kind of those services, you can also start to access other services because those providers know other things. I would say also if your child is a foster child, for example, there are lots of services available for people who are foster parents, and you would want to talk to your case manager about that. If your child is adopted, I know in Vermont, Easter Seals works specifically with kids who have adoption trauma and works to support them. So there are lots of services. It can just be really difficult to find it and locate it. So if you can find a case manager, a social worker, somebody to work with you on this, and again, oftentimes the schools, because your child will have a special education case manager, they're often a great place to start and to reach out and branch out to other sources.
That was super helpful. I always forget about 211, but I shouldn't because it's so easy to remember. So as we wrap up, what are the takeaways that you would want a parent who's listening to take with them from this episode who maybe has been dealing with helping their child with this diagnosis for a while or maybe is newly diagnosed?
Sure. So the things I'd want somebody to take away from this is get help and get it early. Especially if you start to see the development of conduct disorder with this callousness, lack of empathy. That is a place where you do not want to be going at that alone. That requires really specialized treatment because you do not want that to progress into full-blown antisocial personality disorder and all its attendant really like life-altering issues, right? So you want to catch this as early as possible while also recognizing again that some things are developmentally appropriate. Your child is going to be defiant when they are a teenager, and that is developmentally appropriate, right? But yes, get help, get it early. It's not a sign of failure or anything like that. Try to provide as much stability in your child's life. Try to be on the same page with all of the caregivers in your child's life, and that includes a wide variety of caregivers, right? Not just your co-parent, but aunts, uncle, teachers, anybody else who might be considered an authority figure over the child. You want to all of you be on the same page. And that can be really hard because especially older generations tend to be along the lines of, well, you do what I say because I'm the adult and you're the child and you have to do what I say. It can be difficult to get grandma on board sometimes, grandpa on board. But again, that's where family therapy can be really helpful, and having somebody who's an expert in this really talk about this is why we need to be having these conversations with the child versus just being punitive with the child. We want to help them understand the why of what we're asking them to do. So ODD, again, for me, it's more about the child wanting to retake control in a really unstable environment, situation, or traumatic thing. For conduct disorder, for me, again, there's a stronger genetic link, and there's that lack of empathy and desire to hurt others that really distinguishes between the two. The other thing, again, don't back a child with ODD into a corner. You want to give them as much autonomy as possible, especially over things that don't matter too much, right? So if your child wants to paint their room neon green and you're like, no, I don't want, that's gonna be hideous. I don't want my child's room to be neon green, right? Well, that's their safe space, right? That's where they go to comfort, right? And if that's what's comforting to them, at the end of the day, what does it matter to you, right? Say, okay, you can paint it neon green, but when we move out, you have to paint it baby blue. That's the deal that we're making right now, right? But give them autonomy and control over things that you can give them control over, like their clothing choices, their food choices, right? And help provide them that sense of ownership that way. For conduct disorder, don't bury your head in the sand. You need a lot of wraparound support. I might be repeating myself here. Another thing that I want people to know that I didn't touch on already, but I think is important, and this is true, I think, for all parents, not just parents dealing with ODD and conduct disorder, but especially true for these parents, is pick the battles you fight, but win the battles you pick, right? And by that, again, let go of the things that don't matter, the things that do matter, which are especially around like safety, about respecting other people's bodily autonomy, their property, being kind to other people, right? You really want to be sure that you have clear consequences for all those things and clearly let them know why this is not acceptable. So again, let the little things go that might be triggering to you personally, but in the grand scheme of things, does it matter whether your kid finishes their plate of Brussels sprouts? Is that the fight you want to be having? Probably not. And then the thing that I want everybody to take away more than anything is that a child cannot be more emotionally regulated than the adults around them. You need to work on your own stuff, your own triggers before you do anything else when you are working with any children, I think, but especially kids with ODD and conduct disorder. If you are not calm, if you cannot clearly articulate your position, if you are screaming and yelling, if you are finding yourself like heated in the moment, like your child is going to match your energy. And at the end of the day, you need to be the grown up in this situation. So don't hesitate to tap out, get additional support, take a break, come back to the situation, assuming everybody's like in a safe space and nobody's being hurt or anything like that. Come back to it when you are in a more regulated state. And your child needs to be in a regulated state as well in order to be able to understand why you're asking them to do what you're asking them to do and what the consequences are for not following that, right? If they start to get dysregulated, if you start to get dysregulated, call another timeout. And I also just want to say, I am not a perfect parent. I am sure there are people on this podcast who are going to be like, I saw you screaming at your child in Walmart the other day, right? Absolutely true. Trying to get him to do something he didn't want to do. We are all a work in progress, and we do better when we know better, and we are constantly working to improve. But I don't want anybody to think, oh my gosh, Stephanie is saying I'm the worst parent in the world because I do X, Y, and Z. No. Now that you know better, you can do better and get support, get help, and your child will do better too.
No, I agree with you. And I really like that quote of a child cannot be more emotionally regulated than the adult they're dealing with. That is, I feel like when I am working with adults, that phrase will pop up about when they were children, probably in my mind, because we've all been there on both sides, probably. Because being a parent is real hard, and they don't tell you how hard it is.
And make it look like all sunshine and flowers, right? Like, no, I was just going to say, I don't know about you, but I know when I was a kid, the phrase that I hated the most was don't talk back, right? Don't give me any back talk, right? For me, there's no faster way to shut down a child and just really make them feel like, okay, my person is not somebody that I can go to. This person is not somebody who cares about what I have to say. This person is not somebody that cares about what's going on internally for me, than to just be like, no, just basically shut up and be quiet. So I just really encourage adults. It can be really difficult, but hear your child out, right? And you might tell your child, hey, I don't agree with you. Here's why I don't agree with you, right? You still have to go to bed because you still need to get up in the morning, right? But just the saying no back talk, I think is just really kills a child's spirit, especially if you do that all the time.
I think it's the same thing for me with calm down. You need to calm down because I feel like as a child who heard that at times, it's like, "Well, I see you all the time and you're not very calm. Nobody's telling you to calm down, so why can't I feel whatever it is I'm
Yeah.
feeling?" But then as a parent, it's like you're having a meltdown because you want to wear this purple sock and you can't find it and we're about to be late to this. So it's like all these other things are happening and it is difficult I think at times to just put yourself in the perspective of what actually matters. We all do have to feel our feelings and even learning how to emotionally regulate and be like, okay, we're upset. What's this about? And even like sitting with them to work through it. That is a skill that is difficult to learn and takes a little bit, but it's the same thing, don't back
Yeah.
talk, calm down. It's a human thing to want to think for yourself and question what you're being told or to feel your emotions and all those kinds of things. And parenting is just a big basket of fun
Uh-huh.
and confusion.
Yeah. And I think that's a great way to reframe it, right? Is that when these children grow up, we want them to be independent thinkers. We want them to think critically about, like, why am I being asked to do something, right? Why is my friend being like, yeah, let's go steal a stop sign, right? Wait, is that a good idea? Just stop and think. My boss is asking me to do something that might be illegal. Do I want my child to just follow blindly? No, I don't. I don't. So we want to raise adults that can think critically and can be like strong enough to say, no, I'm not going to do that. That goes against my code of ethics. That goes against what I believe in and stuff like that. So again, there goes that really understanding piece, right? Of like understanding why something is being asked and helping them develop like that own central core ability to essentially stand up for themselves. And so I really want to encourage people to reframe ODD in that way and say, hey, this kid has a great quality. We just need to channel it into a productive way.
Yeah, I love that. That makes a lot of sense. Stephanie, we really appreciate you being here today and sharing all your knowledge and experience with us. And for those listening, if you haven't already, please subscribe on your favorite listening platform. If you haven't, please consider leaving us a rating and review also on your favorite listening platform. And if you have questions, comments, concerns, or feedback of any kind, please reach out to us at dhbhs.media@hitchcock.org. And thank you again for listening and have a wonderful day.